Good. Well, thank you very much, Paul Bendis. Welcome. My name's Peter Gower, Vice President here, and standing in for our regular President, Paul Charbonneau, who sent his regrets, and looking forward very much to a different evening this evening. And for those who are at home, you are missing the biggest crowd we have ever had. I can't even see a place to sit, you know. We're just about full. That's great. Any announcements from any of council? And I know Duncan will have some announcements about future meetings later on. And anything from people who are watching on Zoom. And you've got no announcements there. It's all good. So, Duncan, it's all yours.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to the fourth of our spring series of lectures. It's my pleasure to introduce both our speaker, Maggie Ross, and also initially just briefly frame our topic for tonight. Traditionally, the Society has tended to see Kingston history through the prism of traditional history, political history, the activities of politicians like Campbell, MacDonald, and Mowat, through economic history, the river trade, what went on in the docks, the railways, as we found out last month, religious history, of course, and probably military history was up there, very much in the foreground of what we have traditionally done. But Canadian and history in general has moved on tremendously since the Society was founded in 1893. In the 1960s, thanks largely to input from France, the so-called Annales School, we began to look at history from the bottom up rather than the top down. The Annales School initiated social history, and from that has come a wonderful harvest of new types of history, taking us towards gender, sexuality, as we'll find out tonight, working class or labor history, as it's now called. And it's tonight that we are going to focus on an aspect of social history when Margaret or Maggie Ross presents her research on late 19th and early 20th century sexual regulation in Kingston. Now, Maggie is a graduate of Dalhousie, King's College, Dalhousie, where she did her BA, an MA at Western, and is now a senior doctoral student at Queen's, who tells me she is dangerously close to finishing a doctorate. So congratulations to her. Her area of expertise and writing, already published in the Journal of the History of Sexuality, is the how women navigated sexual labor across what we now call the sex trade across the province, and how regional communities developed distinctive methods of regulating and profiting from the existence of sex trades. So without further ado, I'll invite Maggie up here, and we'll look forward to what she has to say.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Kingston Historical Society for inviting me to give this talk, and to all of you for being here. In January of 1915, Kingston Alderman Hugh Nicol stood up in City Hall and declared, "There is no more immoral town between Halifax and Vancouver than Kingston." He told the mayor and other councilmen that because police neglected to enforce morality bylaws, taverns rented rooms for prostitution, while brothels were so full at night that you can't get into them, he said. Young girls, Nicol claimed, were started on the wrong path at dances, then ended up in disorderly houses throughout Kingston, which he compared to the Tenderloin of New York City. Not only did police fail to root out prostitution, he argued, but other bylaw infractions like gambling and liquor smuggling also went unpunished. It would be easy for us to take Nicol's claims at face value and believe that prostitution was somehow more flagrant than ever before in Kingston.
Right now, obviously, right?
But as I read deeper into city
Correct.
and newspaper reports, it became apparent that stirring up outrage about prostitution served both economic and political ends. At the time, it was 6 months after Canada's entry into the First World War. and Kingston was facing steep municipal debt, unemployment, and resistance to increasing taxation. In the weeks that followed Nichols' outburst, the police dramatically increased the number of prostitution and liquor cases that it pursued in court, which directed much needed revenue toward the city. At his direction, the city council raised the licensing fees for theaters, pool rooms, and cabs fourfold without complaint from local residents, having established that these places were sites of prostitution. The heightened concern about prostitution in 1915 also served to empower groups beyond the police. For the duration of the war, the newly established military police conducted its own prostitution raids, while the Children's Aid Society intervened to rescue women from brothels and place their children into foster care. Women's reform groups also benefited from the attention on prostitution by hiring a police matron to handle prostitution cases for the Kingston police. So, during and after the war, Kingston sex workers found themselves under surveillance from many directions. But what was forgotten in Nichols' attack on the police were sex workers themselves. They had been reduced to stereotypes about innocent girls falling into prostitution by going out with the wrong men to dances. His narrative erased the truth that sex work was a response to economic need, which at the time was being conducted by many residents of Kingston, including the wives of overseas soldiers. And my narrative about the political power of prostitution to alleviate municipal debt and empower reform groups doesn't tell us much more about the lives of sex workers either. So my presentation tells a different story about Kingston sex work by centering the women themselves. Covering the period from 1860 to the 1920s, I'll describe the locations and forms of prostitution and introduce you to the women working in the sex industry. Prostitution was not the covert and hidden vice trade that Nichols made it out to be. In fact, there was a brothel steps away from City Hall, and prostitution was deeply intertwined with other industries and the prison system. I'll also discuss Kingston's approach to prostitution regulation, showing how the city's priorities shifted over time from harsh law and punishment in the 19th century to a system that involved reformers, the military, and other institutions with quasi-policing powers in the 20th century. I'll end my presentation by speaking about local sex work activism in recent decades. But before getting into Kingston's sex work history, I want to provide some context about my own research process. First, I was interested in Kingston because of its status as a small city, since major urban centers like Montreal and Vancouver have received the bulk of historical attention. And unlike most other Ontario cities, Kingston's conviction records have been miraculously preserved, meaning that it's possible to research prostitution cases, which were prosecuted in the lower courts, often called police courts. In 2020, these records were held by the Kingston Police in their Division Street headquarters. Although they eventually let me in to view the records, it was a unique experience. Unlike in an archive, the material was unclassified and stored in a cardboard box in someone's office. And although the records were over 100 years old, I had to agree to encrypt the images of them for my viewing only, then destroy them by 2022. This was an obvious problem for my ongoing research. I was also supervised by a police officer who I tried to convince about the importance of making records publicly accessible. Luckily for researchers, a year after, these historic records were transferred to the Queen's Archives and now are fully accessible. I hope that other departments that hold historic records, like the Toronto Police, will eventually make their history accessible too. Using these records, I compiled 291 prostitution-related cases that came before Kingston's court from 1880 to 1920. Focusing on vagrancy, disorderly house, and house of ill fame charges, I compiled statistics about Kingston's prostitution convictions, fines, and sentencing patterns. I'll come back to these stats later in the presentation, but for now, I want to give some background about Kingston's sex trade. I conducted the following research using accounts from the Daily British Whig and the Kingston Standard, as well as municipal files and the conviction records. In the late 19th century, Kingston was a small urban center with a population of just over 12,000 people and industry based on shipping, the military, and manufacturing. To service these male-dominated fields, Kingston women operated a profitable sex trade that sustained sex workers and provided income for maids, cooks, security guards, landlords, cab drivers, musicians, and others who were associated with the industry. The height of Kingston's brothel culture was in the late 19th century, and houses of ill fame were found near military camps and areas of entertainment where potential clients frequented. One of the most notorious brothels in the 1860s and 1870s stood in the vicinity of the Crystal Palace, an exhibition building and fairground on the corner of Bath and Palace Roads in Kingston's West End. Located on Johnson Street, the brothel was nicknamed Ironclad because its shutters were made of sheet iron. In the 1860s, the house was rented by Minnie Smith, who employed 3 sex workers and a maid. Smith's client base included visitors to the Crystal Palace, sailors from the docks, and soldiers garrisoned at Berryfield Military Camp and other temporary military bases. Her business was very prosperous, and after she and her employees were arrested in 1868, Smith was able to put up $900 in cash to cover their bails, just a staggering amount for the 1860s. Despite the financial draw of entertaining soldiers, they posed a threat to Smith's business when fights broke out. For protection, she employed a security guard and owned 2 revolvers, which she wasn't afraid to use. In the summer of 1868, over 300 volunteer militiamen were stationed on the Crystal Palace Fairgrounds for training. On the first Saturday night after their arrival, a soldier accused Smith of shooting at him as he approached her brothel, and he promised retaliation. Reading between the lines, since most madams didn't randomly shoot at potential clients, I would have to assume that the soldier was either too drunk to be admitted or making threats. The next day, the women were entertaining some cavalrymen when around 50 soldiers attacked the exterior of the house with stones, clubs, and firearms. One soldier was shot, and although it was unclear who fired the bullet, police arrested Smith and her employees. She abandoned the house shortly after. Minnie Smith continued to work in the sex trade until at least the early 1880s, when she operated a small brothel in Portsmouth, just outside of Kingston near the penitentiary. The Ironclad house was occupied next by Fanny Wolverer, who also drew large financial profits from the brothel. She recruited women to work in her brothel directly from the criminal court, paying the fines of women charged with being, quote, prostitute vagrants, and having them move into her house. Wolverer was a savvy businesswoman as well, and she used her income to issue loans to individuals in the community. Once again, the military was connected to the brothel's closure. In 1870, authorities insisted that police raid the house. Despite the military's determination that the house remain empty, another madam was arrested for operating a brothel there less than a year later. The other main location for prostitution was Spencer's Grove in Kingston's northeast end on the Cataraqui River. Despite geographic isolation in what was otherwise an industrial area, the Grove brothels were well situated for securing clients due to their proximity to the Cataraqui Bridge. The bridge connected Kingston to the town of Berryfield, which featured military garrisons, naval yards, and other industry where young single men worked. These houses of ill fame were structured as family businesses, with widowed mothers managing the operations, while their daughters entertained the men. Margaret Awesome was in her 50s, English-born, and kept a brothel on Orchard Street with her daughter, Nancy Spence, in the 1860s. By 1871, Nancy Spence was keeping her own house of ill fame at 6 Orchard Street, near her mother's residence. There was little distinction between the brothel and the home place, as Smith lived in her place of work with her daughters, other sex workers, and their young children. Mary Wright, a 49-year-old widow, operated a competing brothel at 9 Orchard Street, where she employed 4 women, including her daughter Samantha. City authorities were critical of women who profited from the sexual labor of their family members. When Wright pleaded her innocence after an arrest in 1869, the magistrate moralized, "And you are the blessed white hen who never lays astray. You didn't make prostitutes out of your own daughters, I suppose." Like the ironclad brothel, the houses in the Grove were successful businesses that circulated capital between customers, sex workers, and the broader community. In this case, male property owners were linked to the sex trade. Because prostitution was criminalized, yet tolerated or ignored by police, landlords were able to charge high rent without concern that they would be arrested themselves, even though Kingston's bylaws outlawed renting for prostitution. At least 4 men rented Grove houses to madams in the 1860s and 1870s, while living in nicer neighborhoods downtown. Robert Matthews, who you can see in the PowerPoint, was a gentleman who lived on Johnson Street while leasing properties to Margaret Awesome and Nancy Spence. On the other hand, Robert Spencer, for whom Spencer's Grove was named, lived in the Grove because his ice cutting company was located on the Cataraqui River. Due to his proximity to the brothels, he was occasionally able to testify in favor of his tenants when they appeared in court. When brothels were broken up by police, women simply found different houses to lease in the same neighborhood, and tenants switched landlords every few months. As a result, although the property assessment records here make it look like women rented for a year at a time, I know from newspaper descriptions of court proceedings that they often swapped houses with other sex workers. Kingston's taxis also levied profits from prostitution. Nancy Spence had an arrangement with cab drivers to bail her out of jail after arrests, and they took a cut of her profits in exchange for promoting her business and driving customers to the house. This partnership ensured that Spence could continue her operations while awaiting trial, and her brothel had steady streams of customers and visitors from out of town. Men frequented the Grove in pursuit of liquor, women, and a good time. Spence charged $3 for men to spend the evening upstairs with one of her girls. One client visited Spence's brothel the day after he was released from jail for committing fraud. To celebrate his freedom, he brought a large goose to the House of Ill Fame, stating that he was determined to enjoy himself all weekend through women and food. Entertaining clients ensured the success of the Grove businesses, and the Kingston Press noted that the women wore exquisite attire, including ostrich feathers and leather gloves. Although descriptions of women's physical appearances often referred to their upward mobility, they could also serve as derogatory commentary on the types of lives that they led, particularly for women who solicited outdoors. Carrie Vantren, an American-born girl from 3 Mile Bay, was arrested for vagrancy in 1882 after police spotted her surrounded by admirers in a public park. The wig described her as a brazen little piece, dressed in polka dot print and turban. It hinted that the effect of Vantrin's lifestyle was visible on her body, commenting, "She has a handsome face, but it is now well bronzed by her continued exposure to the sun and wind." Another way that newspapers stigmatized people with criminal records was by publishing, once a month, the names of everyone who'd faced charges in the previous 30 days. As you can see here, the vast majority of women were charged for prostitution, drunkenness, and homelessness, or a combination of all three. The papers used terminology like vagrant prostitute, vagrant idiot, and drunken prostitute, which further stigmatized women who were dependent on liquor and solicited outdoors. While Kingston's 19th century sex trade featured well-known houses of ill fame in specific geographic locations, the city's early 20th century brothels were informal in nature and scattered around the downtown area. Since the Canadian militia abandoned Fort Henry in 1891, soldiers were no longer the main purchasers of sex, and most women's clients were laborers or sailors until the First World War. Police referred to private residences that sold both alcohol and sex as disorderly houses. Disorderly houses featured fewer women than houses of ill fame and did not have the same levels of management, often foregoing hiring security guards or housekeepers. Sex work continued to be linked to the prison system, with some women circulating for years between prisons, reformatories, and brothels. This meant that the justice system served to punish sex workers as much as it created them through stigmatization and reduced employment opportunities. Fanny Campbell returned to disorderly houses after each of her 4 terms in the county jail and Toronto's Mercer Reformatory, a women's prison which aimed to teach domestic employment and Christian instruction. Some women sold sex in private residences, typically north of Princess Street, but others solicited on the downtown streets. During the winter, women secured clients in taverns and restaurants, but once the spring weather was warm enough, they typically waited for customers outside on Princess Street near the Grand Theatre. Streetwalkers also solicited in public gardens, including Victoria Park and City Park, or in berry fields near the shipyards on Lake Ontario. After securing a client, women brought them to hotels that rented rooms by the hour, coal shacks on Ontario Street, to boathouses, or to brothels. Women who solicited sex tended to do so out of poverty. Catherine Nattell was abandoned by her husband Oscar in 1905 when she was in her early 30s. She then converted her house at 68 Cherry Street into a brothel where she employed 2 women. Nattell used the income to support herself and her son until her arrest in 1908. The forms of legal employment available to Kingston women were often unstable and low-paying. As a result, some women combined sexual labor with work in restaurants, textile factories, or as domestic servants. In addition to the potential profits from prostitution, there were numerous risks associated with Kingston's sex trade. Brothels were sites of vandalism and fights. Nancy Spence's house was briefly shut down after her 2 brothers had a fight which resulted in one of their deaths. Women were also at risk of assault and property damage from clients and even from other sex workers and madams. Competition in the Grove between Nancy Spence and Mary Wright often turned violent. Women who refused men's sexual advances were also at risk. Elizabeth Mills, who solicited on the streets in the 1860s, was brutally kicked by 3 men near the landfill because she would not gratify their lusts. Another risk for sex workers was arrest and incarceration. despite the fact that the Kingston police often ignored brothel prostitution. As historian Leslie Erickson has noted, Canadian police forces commonly tolerated indoor prostitution, and this was no different in Kingston. Despite the occasional promise to crack down on brothels, the police generally did not try to eliminate them. Instead, they raided houses in response to violence or complaints. In fact, the statistics I compiled of Kingston's conviction record from the 1880s to the 1920s would show that Kingston's court meted out harsh punishments in the 19th century that gradually became lighter in nature in the early 20th century. John Duff, the magistrate from 1881 to 1902, convicted 165 women for prostitution-related offenses. Of this number, 70% of women were imprisoned for at least 6 months, and over 40% received a year or longer, typically at the Mercer Reformatory. When Magistrate James Farrell took over in 1903, prostitution-related convictions occurred less often, and the punishments were relatively light in comparison. From then until 1920, 95 women were sentenced at the police court. Of this number, 22% received at least 6 months in jail, and only 4% spent a year or longer in prison. Maybe we would think that these statistics reflect increasing tolerance for sex work and understanding about the limited employment options for women at the time. But I suggest that the relative decline in prosecutions and severity of punishment is highly misleading. These statistics belie the fact that police and magistrates had wide-ranging legal tools to use against sex workers. And as I will demonstrate, quasi-state surveillance over working-class women accused of prostitution vastly increased at the same time as conviction rates decreased. At the time, sex workers were subject to an array of federal and municipal laws. The vagrancy provisions of the 1892 Criminal Code forbade keeping, frequenting, or being inmates in bawdy houses. It also outlawed being a common prostitute outdoors without providing, quote, a satisfactory account of herself. Kingston's bylaws similarly criminalized keeping and being inmates of bawdy houses, in addition to the charge of being in any way connected with brothels. This wording was vaguer than the criminal code and likely easier under which to secure a conviction. Sex workers who faced criminal charges had little recourse for justice. Women rarely secured legal representation, either because they could not afford it or because lawyers refused to represent them. Catherine Nattell was declined by 4 lawyers to defend her against charges of keeping a disorderly house in 1908. Of course, the men accused of purchasing sex in the brothel had no trouble securing prominent Kingston lawyers, including a former mayor. But it was rare for male clients to need lawyers in the first place because they were almost never charged with purchasing sex. Prosecution and punishment were strictly gendered, and this reflected the sexual double standard that was pervasive in Canadian society. From 1880 to 1920, only 10% of prostitution charges were against men, and most men were dismissed or paid a small fine in court. Had clients been targeted equally as often as women, men would have faced far more charges because the numbers of customers always exceeded the numbers of sex workers. Police and magistrates were often reluctant to press charges against male purchasers of sex because the burden of proof to secure a conviction was higher than it was for women. Both Kingston's bylaws and the criminal code forbade women from being an inmate in a bawdy house, meaning that sex workers could be convicted for being found in a brothel once. The same laws criminalized men for being habitual frequenters, so judges had to establish that a man visited a house at least 3 times in order to convict him. For instance, Magistrate Farrell dismissed charges against a man found in Catherine Nattel's brothel in 1908, telling him, "It is just a question of whether you come under the legal head of a frequenter of the house or not, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt." Fanny Campbell, however, was charged for having been found in the brothel once. A woman's imprisonment placed significant burden on her family, and sex workers increasingly risked losing their children to the custody of the Children's Aid Society, which was founded in Kingston in 1895. In the 19th century, children sometimes accompanied their mothers to jail or waited with relatives. But by the early 20th century, Children's Aid sent children to orphanages or foster homes. Fanny Campbell was separated from her young children in 1906 while she spent a year at the Mercer Reformatory. She was 24 years old at the time and had 4 children. Catherine Nattel's 4-year-old son was handed over to Children's Aid in 1908 while she spent 6 months in the Mercer. So, while the conviction record shows lighter punishments in the 20th century, they obscure the fact that the lives of sex workers who faced incarceration were considerably harmed by harsh jail conditions, the loss of family, and blame for an occupation from which they had very few options to escape had they wished to do so. The statistics also obscure the many ways that 20th century sex workers became regulated by organizations other than the police, such as the CAS. Nichols' outburst at City Hall during the war is a good entry point to understanding how this process happened. Since the beginning of the war, prostitution had become more visible, and the influx of soldiers and their families into Kingston increased both the number of sex workers and potential clients. Women whose husbands were serving with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, or CEF, often found that it was challenging to raise families on soldiers' pay. Although some women found jobs in textile or munitions factories, others entered prostitution. Disorderly houses were often run by soldiers' wives while their husbands served overseas or were based in camps at Berryfield or Valcartier, Quebec. At least 14 houses operated during the war, most of which were located north of Princess on Chatham and Nelson Streets. As I stated at the beginning of the presentation, by 1915, Kingston faced a municipal deficit of nearly $20,000 and growing rates of unemployment. Despite efforts from City Council to create jobs, residents blamed elected officials for excessive spending and rejected propositions to offset the debt by increasing property taxes. It was in this climate of attacks on the council and anxiety about debt that Alderman Nicholl launched his attack against the police department for allowing prostitution to proliferate and for failing to pursue fines in court. He also exposed a secret agreement between the chief of police and the provincial liquor license inspector that permitted the inspector to enforce most provisions of the Liquor License Act, meaning that previously the fines paid by offenders for liquor offenses had all gone to the province rather than to the city of Kingston. The police responded to these accusations of incompetency and collusion by increasing the number of arrests for liquor and prostitution cases, which remained high throughout the duration of the war. Policing alcohol meant necessarily policing sex work, as brothels illegally sold liquor, and many women soliciting outdoors were dependent on alcohol. There were more prostitution-related arrests in the first month of 1915 than there had been in the entire preceding year. By September, the press referred to the ongoing crackdown on street walking as a crusade against immorality. Despite the public outcry against the sex trade, vulnerable women witnessed few attempts at positive intervention into their lives. it is unlikely that their increased interactions with the justice system resulted in anything other than blame, condescension, and prolonged incarceration. While police ramped up arrests of sex workers, other institutions also expanded their reach over working class women during and after 1915. Kingston women were subjected to intensified sexual regulation from the military police, who assisted the Kingston police with brothel raids, performed their own arrests of sex workers, and sentenced women to jail for prostitution offenses. Some of these charges don't appear in the conviction records, only in press reports, meaning that we don't even know the full degree to which the military targeted sex workers. The first known brothel raid by the military police took place in December of 1914, and by early 1915, the Whig credited the military for their aggressive work policing the morals of the city. Although policing civilians for prostitution offenses off military grounds was outside their jurisdiction, the military may have been concerned about soldiers committing desertion or contracting venereal disease. The military had a good relationship with the Kingston police, and the two forces conducted brothel raids together. In January 1915, 3 military policemen assisted constables to make arrests in a brothel north of Princess Street where soldiers frequented. James and Mary Ann Scullion ran the brothel at 43 Stevens Street, where they lived with their 4 children. After the raid, the children were sent to St. Mary's of the Lake Orphanage. By September of 1915, press reports stated that because of the military police, more women had been incarcerated in September than any month in previous years, with drunkenness, vagrancy, and keeping disorderly houses being the main charges. Several more women had been deported from Canada entirely. Kingston women were also subjected to a new era of moral surveillance after a police matron was hired in 1915 at the request of women's organizations. The local Council of Women and the Women's Christian Temperance Union had been advocating for a police matron since 1884. The Board of Police Commissioners had refused their demands until 1915, after Nichols' criticism of police management. Described as a motherly woman, the police matron dealt with feminine issues that male officers were perceived to be unable to handle, including searching female prisoners, caring for abandoned infants, and providing advice for women with domestic troubles. Of course, the matron's main responsibility was surveillance over young women's sexuality, thus reflecting growing concern about juvenile delinquency among working-class youth that has been noted by Canadian historians. Kingston's first police matron, Annie Smith, took an active role against prostitution, investigating social conditions herself and receiving complaints about immoral behavior. She charged young women with vagrancy at the police court and testified that they were soliciting outdoors and picking up men in restaurants. Magistrate Farrell took the matron's views into account when sentencing sex workers and consulted her about whether they deserved a second chance or jail time was the only option for reformation. The matron even monitored women whose criminal charges had been dismissed, with girls reporting to Smith at stated intervals to prove that they were, quote, being put on the right track. The hiring of a police matron reflects how policing became linked to moral reform interests, with female reformers successfully lobbying for their say in how the city dealt with vice. While the entry of women into Kingston's police force was a feminist success, it came at the expense of limiting the movements of sex workers. That the position was only established in 1915 after decades of failed attempts only further confirms that prostitution served political strategies. By seizing on a moment of public attention on prostitution and delinquency, female reformers advanced a goal which was divorced from the realities of the sex trade and did not reduce prostitution. The Children's Aid Society also played an expanded role in policing sexuality after 1915. In fact, it worked closely with the military police and police matron to remove sex workers' children into foster care. For instance, 23-year-old Blanche Deline lost custody of her children in 1916. Described as a well-dressed woman, Deline operated a brothel downtown at the corner of Johnson and Ontario Streets. The house was well situated to attract clients, as it was steps away from the Grand Trunk railway station, which brought soldiers into the city. Deline and her 2 children had relocated from Margaret to Kingston after her husband, Frank, had enlisted in the CEF in 1915. Blanche was arrested that November after police received complaints that soldiers were visiting the house at all hours. She was then monitored in the police cells by the matron. In court, the military police testified that Deline and other women were often loitering around with soldiers at Artillery Park near a garrison. Deline was sentenced to 3 months in jail, and her children were handed over to the Children's Aid. The Kingston police matron, and the Children's Aid Society increasingly worked together to regulate prostitution, and young women found themselves monitored from numerous directions. Like the matron, Children's Aid inspectors provided evidence to police about girls charged with vagrancy. In 1916, police arrested Cassie Babcock for entertaining men in Artillery Park. In court, Provincial CAS Inspector J.J. Kelso disclosed that her mother was deceased and her father in Napanee needed this girl to help look after the children, but the girl was wayward. Despite promising to go back to her family, she was sent to jail for 6 months. By exploring this historical moment in 1915 and its reverberations in the years after, I hope to convey the political and economic usefulness of prostitution for a variety of groups. Raising panic about prostitution allowed the city to offset its deficit through fines and licensing fees. It resulted in the first women being hired by the police and allowed other groups like the CAS and military police to expand their authority and control over women. And as we've seen, these institutions became increasingly linked together to monitor sexuality during and beyond the First World War. These examples also teach us that court records should be balanced with other source bases, since Kingston's lighter approach to prostitution was actually deeply invasive. The limitations of the historical record mean that I don't have much insight into how women responded to the criminalization of prostitution at the time. But I do know that Kingston has a rich legacy of sex work activism that I want to touch on while concluding the presentation. Kingston's Sex Worker Action Group, or SWAG for short, was created by sex workers around 15 years ago to organize against laws that criminalized prostitution. It was most active in 2012 and 2013, when sex workers fought and won a constitutional challenge to Canada's prostitution laws, a case we call Canada v. Bedford. At the time, SWAG did a ton of advocacy. Its members wrote letters of solidarity, hosted self-defense classes for sex workers, and ran a drop-in center. Now, SWAG is run by a number of non-sex workers, including myself and a few others from the nonprofit sector. And we do education outreach through social media and provide safe sex supplies at locations in Kingston. Organizations like SWAG are all the more important today. In 2021, the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which represents 25 sex worker organizations, launched another constitutional challenge to Canada's current prostitution laws, which put their safety at risk. It's our job to keep historical legacies alive in places like Kingston and put them to work for present-day sex worker activism. Thank you.
Maggie, thank you for a scintillating performance. Scintillating in the sense that it is wonderful to see a historian discovering sources, using them, analyzing them, not simply providing a narrative, but getting into the narrative and providing analysis of it. And in the case of this lovely little city of Kingston, pulling the curtain back and showing us a more gritty side of the community's existence. So thank you very much. We are very happy to take questions now, both from the audience in the room or in the Zoom land. So I would ask you, if you have a question, to simply raise your hand and wait for Alan over here, who will bring the microphone to you, so you can be well heard. Yes, please, the question in the back.
I'd be very curious to hear about your work with swag. 100 years on, more than 100 years on. You explained where we were. Where are we now and where are we headed? What can we do to make, as Duncan said, the curtain come back more? I mean, this is an occupation that's not going to go away. It's probably the oldest occupation in the world.
Thank you for the question.
Is that coming from somebody here? You can't hear? Repeat the question.
So the question was about swag or current sex worker activism and what people can do today to support sex workers. So basically it's harder in a small city like Kingston because places like Toronto have a lot more funding and a lot more vigor behind their activism. And at the moment, there aren't any active sex workers working with swag. And so it's really our hope that eventually the group will be taken back over by sex workers who can run the group for themselves. And in the meantime, what we're doing is more historical outreach, and they have bins throughout Kingston with sex supplies. But what we can do to support sex workers, at least in Kingston, from what I've heard from those working in the nonprofit sector with more knowledge than me, is really to support harm reduction for drugs, because that's where they see the most harms against sex workers who solicit outside and who are more vulnerable to attacks or overdoses and things like that. So I think that's how we can support them the most. Thank you.
What is the biggest current gap in the legislation today? Now, they decriminalize sex work, but there's another big gap, I believe. Could you speak on that, please? Thank you.
Great question. So basically, Canada's current prostitution laws are called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, and they criminalize half of the transaction. So it's legal for you to sell sex, but it's illegal for anyone to purchase sex. But that said, there are also a lot of other ways that sex work is still criminalized. For instance, criminalizing third-party involvement in sex work. So sex workers can't hire security guards or work together in brothels because that would be living off the avails of each other's prostitution. And sex workers, I mean, I had a sex worker do a guest lecture for my class, and they were talking about the difficulties of having a transaction safely go through where half of it is criminalized. So for instance, she was saying that it's hard to verify the identity of people because those purchasing sex have an incentive to not let their identity actually be known. And this creates harms for sex workers and makes it less safe for them to perform sex work. So at the moment, Canadian sex workers are lobbying to decriminalize everything and have the entire transaction be decriminalized. And they would also want third-party, like procuring or material benefits also to be decriminalized, so they could, work together in a brothel indoors, which would be more safe because safety comes in numbers. So great question, thank you.
Maybe I could ask a question. There was no medical dimension in what you had to say. Was there a critique of the medical fallout of prostitution? You mentioned the military raids in the war. What I've read is that the military were raiding because they were fearful of syphilis and gonorrhea, reducing the strength in the front ranks. I'm not sure what moral dimension they brought to it. So was there a medical kind of commentary on what was going on?
I presume that there was medical commentary going on amongst the military police, and I wish I had their records, but I've never been able to find confirmation that any military records survived past the First World War. So if there are any military historians who know more about how to get military police records, I would deeply appreciate that. And in fact, the medical element of prostitution is pretty absent from my dissertation project in general, because I don't have access to any medical records beyond what the newspapers say about wanting to reduce syphilis or blaming sex workers for the proliferation of venereal disease. But I do know that Kingston set up a venereal disease clinic in Kingston, I think in 1916. And so it was at least trying to treat people. But I'm not sure how effective it was at actually halting the spread of VD. Since women could still solicit outdoors and soldiers were obviously going overseas, and that's where the bulk of VD actually came from in England.
When I was in the archives a while ago, I stumbled on the jail books, I stumbled on the jail books, and I was looking for something else, but I realized quickly how many of the entries were prostitutes and how many of them were repeat offenders. And there's one, I saw her name on yours, I think her name was Mary Redford. And I saw her over and over and over again for 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, maybe with a month in between. And I wonder if a lot of them were using or were happy to be in jail, put a roof over their heads.
That's a great question. Historians pretty much refer to this subculture of people that circulated between the jails or were homeless or drunk outside or soliciting sex as jailbirds. And Mary Redfern honestly feels like an old friend of mine at this point, because I've seen her come up so many times in the jail records and in the newspapers. And for a certain time, I could almost map who she was friends with in the city, other sex workers, who she was not friends with, and who she would have fights with, and then they would get dragged in for assault of each other. So yeah, I mean, what I have noticed though is that people tend to be more outside in the summer, and then around November or December, there's this influx of people coming in for prostitution offenses and then getting 6 months in jail. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the coldest months of the year that people are almost electing to spend in jail. At the time, it was under City Hall. And in the summer, they would rather go outside and be free out there. So I think it testifies to the need then for social services and the need today for those as well.
Margaret, that was an excellent paper. I just wanted to make 2 points. Number one, you're talking about the military in World War I. One lead that may be helpful to you is that Lorne Pierce, who later became a publisher, was a sergeant in the military. And for a year, he was a sergeant major at Onwanada Military Hospital in Kingston. And of course, I wasn't looking specifically for your material, but I know he at least talks about some of the patients in the hospital are there with venereal disease and the like. And I think it's worth a look. His diaries are there, and it's a very specific date period. So I would have a ramble through there and see what's there. That's in the Queen's Archives. And the other thing I was impressed by is, you know, some of the sort of equivocation in the coverage of prostitutes. For instance, in that description of the 2 prostitutes from the 19th century, which described what they were wearing, habitually wore, white ostrich feathers and the like. Well, of course, that's on one level free advertising. Given the restricted number of outfits women in the 19th century had, you were sort of saying, well, on one level, keep an eye out for the white ostrich feather and whatever, either if you're in the market for the sex trade or you abhor it and want to avoid them. You picked a fascinating topic and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the feedback. I'll keep an eye out for the book. And I think I'll get your name from people here so I can send you an email about that. And yeah, I think it definitely was free advertising. And all the evidence points to the fact that women would wear their best clothing to go to jail and make appearances in the police court, so that they would look their best in front of the many people in Kingston that would come to see them get convicted in the police court. it was almost like public entertainment. So I think it definitely enticed a few people to visit the brothel or turn some other people away, saying, I'll stay away from those women. But thank you for the comment.
I have a question. What were the oldest records you encountered in Kingston area?
The oldest police records that I came across were from the 1850s, and I didn't do a whole lot of digging into them because my topic was just a little bit later. Also, the handwriting was very tough to read, and sometimes that does play a role in which records I dive deeply into and which ones I do lighter scans of. But it's still something on my mind that I'd like to get into the 1840s and 1850s material. I just wish the police officer's handwriting was a little bit better. But that's the oldest records I've come across. But I think I could find older ones if I were looking. But 1830s, 1840s is kind of outside of my time limit. And I do have to put a time limit on this because I want to finish my dissertation. So I mostly focus on 1870s onward to the 1930s.
I was noticing on the map when you talked about, was it the iron? It looked as though it was just outside of city limits. So did they use that as a defense ever?
They sure did. And I'm so happy you're bringing this up because I did not have time to talk about this in the presentation. But basically the brothel was just outside city limits. And so police then, I guess it was for protection. So women weren't really going to be policed by city officials. But then in some cases, like when the soldiers attacked the brothel, apparently a messenger ran from the brothel to the police, to the city hall, and tried to get policemen to come and get rid of all the soldiers that were attacking the house. But the police said, nah, it's outside of city limits. It's not our problem. We're not going to do anything. And then after a man had been shot and the crowd scattered, then they made their way over to the brothel and ended up, I guess, helping cleaning up and arresting the women. So it can be a double-edged sword, I guess.
No, thank you for that wonderful talk. Your question about soldiers in the First World War, I can't give you a straight answer on what records there are, but it's interesting to remember that before you could volunteer in 1914, you had to, if you were married, you had to have your wife's permission. And I'm not sure now you've just spoken why you had to have that. We've always assumed it was, well, we don't want to break up the family. But in fact, now I wonder if the wife had thought ahead and said, you know, if he's gone, what am I going to do? So I don't know where that legislation came from and whether there's any record of how it was developed. But that might be another source to look at to see what happened in 1914. The regulation stops in after, but certainly there were a number of people who were convicted, either usually with forged signatures. Oh yes, my wife said here's a piece of paper, or were rejected because they did not have permission.
That's very interesting. Thank you for letting me know that because I'd never heard that before. I didn't know. But I had a feeling that I would learn some military facts from the Kingston Historical Society.
Surprise,
Proud.
surprise.
And so this is a helpful venue for me to be at. But I bet women with a lot of children maybe would have said, don't go, because they for sure wouldn't have been able to support themselves without their husband's pay. And then, I guess some women must have gained permission maybe to get rid of their husbands if things weren't going very well. Yeah, but thank you for that.
Just to follow up to the question about city limits, the popular drinking hole in Kingston was in Berryfield. It was called Dollar Bills. And that was outside of city limits, and Queen students, military, anyone who wanted to drink, particularly in Prohibition, wandered over there. So there are parallel, moral endeavors going on in the city.
So the question was about sex workers unionizing and whether there's a case to be made for sex workers to do that now. And sex workers have been unionizing in various places in the world. And so I don't think it will be long before sex workers do that in Canada as well. I'm pretty sure they have in New Zealand and in Ireland. And so it's, I guess, just a matter of time. But I think that what sex workers seem to suggest is that working together either through activism or by performing sex work kind of in groups or with supports for one another is the safest way forward. Yeah, so thank you for that comment.
No, I had a
another point which Peter made me think about with regards to the soldiers in the First World War. There are extensive medical records on all of the soldiers. My grandfather's older brother, who died during the war, was reported EG, which would be gonorrhea, 4 times. You can find out when that started, whether it started here or overseas, when the first case was. And then I'm sure there's enough data there that will give you all sorts of interesting stuff to analyze for your postdoc.
For your second PhD.
Thank you. I looked a little bit into soldiers' records, particularly for Blanche Delaine's husband, Frank, because I mean, I wasn't looking for BD, and honestly, I don't think he had it, but I can't quite remember. But I was looking to see where his pay was directed, and it was directed to the Children's Aid Society in Peterborough for like the duration of World War I. So that was a useful record for that. And I'm almost afraid of what I would find if I went digging very deeply to look at the BD records of soldiers. But I definitely could do that and track some of them. The only slight complicating factor is that usually the press reported on the names of the women who were arrested, but they often somehow omitted the names of the soldiers. And so it would just say 3 soldiers arrested and these specific individual women. But some of them were named and some do appear in the conviction records. So I could go down that path. Yeah, thank you for letting me know.
You touched on one of the frustrations of research, that is giving voice to the people you're writing about. And that clearly is a problem, a challenge for you, because these women didn't have voice. They only had what the magistrate chose to label them with and fit them into a category. That's something for a book. Obviously, if you can, it's going to be very hard. You've given us a wonderful evening. As an old academic, you've revitalized me with the joy, the enthusiasm, and the meticulousness you bring to your research. I wish you all the luck in the world with your doctoral thesis defense. I don't think you'll need very much luck, and the book that lies beyond. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for a good evening. Thank you again for coming tonight. I'll remind you our next lecture will be on Wednesday, the 15th of May, same location, Zoom as well, when we'll be joined by the former Director General of History and Heritage at the Defense Department, Ian McCulloch, who will talk to us about his book on Bradstreet's raid on Kingston in 1758, the first British attempt to take Kingston. So he will be here on the 15th of May. I might also mention that, as usual, on June 6th, we'll celebrate and comment on MacDonald's place in our society at his graveside in Cataraqui Cemetery on June the 6th. The service will be noted on our website. And our speaker this year is a Queen's graduate, Dr. Stephen Smith of Parks Canada, who will talk on MacDonald's 4 Lives at Belleville House. So that's June the 6th at the cemetery. So until next time, thank you for coming.